For the most part, guns and sails in the early modern period took Europeans mainly to islands and coastal regions where they could establish ocean-going contact and use their sea-based cannon to intimidate and threaten. Thus, Europeans over the early modern period seized some port cities in West Africa, occasionally a bit in East Africa, though the European presence was much less significant there. They seized some ports in India, like the Portuguese port of Goa, which was only given back to India a few years ago. They seized island groups in what's now Indonesia. They periodically seized territory in Taiwan. They certainly seized the Philippines. These were places where ships, cannon, and short-distance expeditions from ships would pay off particularly well. It's obviously vital to recognize, no mystery, but it's obviously vital to recognize that with rare exceptions, the interior of Africa and Asia would remain immune to European conquest at this point. The technology was simply not relevant. Europeans made inroads in African territories directly only in Angola, a Portuguese holding, and then a bit later on in South Africa, where the Dutch established a foothold. But otherwise, their dealings with Africa in terms of the use of ships and force are coastal, as is the case with most of Asia. The huge exception, of course, was the Americas, where Europeans had the advantage not just of ships and guns, though this was certainly relevant, but also metal tools and technologies, horses, and a sense of military organization that, in some instances at least, was also superior to that which had been developed among Native American peoples. The European conquest of the Americas, which was gradual. Let's not assume that Europeans suddenly, because they made huge land claims over South America, for example, seized these territories fully. But European success here was absolutely vital, but in terms of the world as a whole, atypical. And remember, it was accompanied by another advantage the Europeans had, if advantage is the right word, that they did not have with regard to Asia and Africa, and that was the advantage of disease. The decimation of American populations because of imported diseases, running up to 80 to 85% of the total Native American population dying off within 2 centuries, whole populations in some cases literally entirely extinguished, minorities remaining in other instances. This cleared the way for European conquest as no other development could. So, the expansion of Europe, the establishment of European military presence was mainly a naval activity, underwritten by new technologies that had developed as Europe encountered Asian societies and utilized the contacts to their own benefit. It was developed in different ways in the Americas because of the very special circumstances that resulted, frankly, primarily from previous American isolation. A question obviously arises with regard to this European weapons advantage as to why no other society in the early modern period decided to rival the Europeans at their own game, and it's a valid question. Several societies doubtless could have done so because they had the metalworking traditions, they had the shipbuilding capacity, they had experience in interregional activity, but they did not do so. The Chinese, for example, although abundantly exposed to European example and interested in some European artifacts, for example, clocks, the Chinese decided not to imitate European patterns at this point, probably partly because of a Confucian reluctance to indulge too many activities that would give greater prestige to merchant values and merchant life, probably because of a bureaucratic suspicion of too much change occurring all at once, but above all, because China simply had no use for these patterns in terms of the purposes seen for Chinese society itself. As we will see more fully in a later discussion, China benefited hugely from Europe's world economy because of the Chinese productive capacity. They didn't need to emulate European weapons patterns and naval patterns in order to seize these benefits. China was interested in maintaining the integrity of the Middle Kingdom against outside invasion. European devices here, particularly naval devices, were of little use. The Chinese proved perfectly capable of organizing their contacts with Europeans through some regulated ports, particularly the port of Macau. They simply did not have problems that European weapons patterns would seem to solve. Something of the same case applies to Japan, although we know a little bit more about debates in this regard. As Europeans first encountered Japan in the 16th century, Japanese were initially rather interested in what the Europeans had to offer. There were even some significant conversions to Christianity. Japan was, after all, a warlike feudal society, and seeing a people with new types of weapons could be a real turn-on. And there was considerable interest in European guns and a quick capacity to manufacture similar types of guns in Japan itself. But at the end of the 16th century, under a ruler named Hideyoshi, the Japanese made a decision to cut off these contacts and to end this degree of interest in European weapons patterns. The decision was motivated first by a realization of what the Europeans were doing to the Philippines, a sense that European control of the Philippines in the name of the Pope, or so the Japanese viewed it, would be so threatening to Japanese culture, the Japanese value system, that the threat simply could not be endured. Japan needed to cut off contact lest what happened to the Philippines happen there. Second, it was clearly realized that while eagerness for European weapons might be a delightful edge for feudal belligerence in the short term, in the long term, European weapons would threaten the system of feudalism itself. Older fighting patterns were essential to maintain feudal values and feudal social relationships, and this maintenance was more important than the opportunities the Europeans seemed to offer. So Japan cut off this kind of interest, regulated the manufacture of guns. In some years in the 17th century, Japan produced only 9 guns per year. This was simply not going to be a dominant pattern for the Japanese political and military system. So, the sense that European patterns, although obviously extremely dynamic, were not relevant to the goals of key societies, a sense of social preservation or cultural preservation or both, motivated a stance toward European technology that was obviously very distinct. Europeans, in turn, quickly developed a sense that whatever their drawbacks with regard to the new societies they were in contact with, in the opulence of cities, the richness of tradition, at least they had a technology edge, and Europeans began to judge other societies mainly by the state of technology, and obviously in the process found their own society vastly superior. An interesting pattern of evaluation that I think still operates in much of the contemporary world. Along with the rise of Europe and its military base, a second key development involved what historians routinely call the Columbian Exchange. Here's where the biological entry of the Americas into the global system had its clear expression. The Columbian Exchange means that biological products moved from the Americas to the rest of the world and from the rest of the world to the Americas. The exchange for the Americas themselves was almost entirely disastrous. Obviously, biological exchange meant that old world domesticated animals were brought to the Americas, and Americans proved very adept at using horses, for example, in this new system. Old world food products like wheat and other grains were also brought to the Americas, where they would embellish the food supply. But the big import biologically to the Americas was disease, and as we've already seen, it had horrendous impact. The impact was accidental. Europeans and Africans did not intend to bring these diseases to the Americas, though over time, by the 18th and 19th centuries, Europeans actually learned deliberately to introduce diseases into Native American populations in order to clear them out. It was initially accidental. It became sometimes intentional.